Okay, this one we're going to go through how to name covalent molecules. So this is different. Ionic is whenever you have a metal present in your compound or molecule. Covalent, there is not a single metal. Every element in your formula is a nonmetal. So remember that nonmetals are going to be elements that lie to the right of the staircase, plus hydrogen. All right, so the rules for covalent are pretty different. There's tiny similarities, but they are pretty different than ionic. So that's why it's super critical that your first step when you're naming something is always to determine if it's going to be ionic or covalent. So for covalent, these are the rules for naming. We'll just kind of use an example to go through it. So the first one is N2O5. I would identify that as covalent because it contains nitrogen and oxygen. Both of those elements are to the right of the staircase. So this is a covalent molecule. So name the first nonmetal. So what I see is N, and N stands for nitrogen. All right, second one, include a prefix which tells you the number of atoms on that element. So nitrogen has a 2, so that prefix for 2, if I go up to my little chart here, again, this is in your book, but anytime you have 2 of something, you use di. Okay, so I'll have dinitrogen. Then I go to step 3, which says name the second nonmetal. So that's going to be oxygen. This is the only part that's the same as ionic. You're going to change the ending to "ide." So oxygen is going to become oxide. Step 4, you have to again include the prefix that tells you the number of atoms there are of that element. So on oxygen there's 5 of them. For 5 we use the prefix penta. And so that would be called dinitrogen pentaoxide. So if you've already watched the ionic video, you'll see that ionics have no prefixes in them whatsoever, never. And that's probably the biggest mistake that I see students make is once they learn prefixes, they get super excited and want to put prefixes on everything that they see, which is wrong. You actually do not use prefixes often at all because there's not a lot of molecules that are actually classified as covalent. So just be super careful that you only use these prefixes if the compound is covalent, which means there's only nonmetals in it. All right, so our next example, CO2. Again, we're going to name our first nonmetal, which is carbon. I need to use a prefix to identify how many atoms are in carbon. Since there's no number next to it, I assume it's 1. 1 is mono. Now here's the one exception with covalence. If your very first element only has 1 of it, you don't use mono. So mono is never used on the first element. So this is just going to be carbon. You would not put mono on it. So that's the one exception with the prefixes. Mono is never, ever, 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 ever used on the first element, only on the second element. So this would just stay as carbon. I would go to my next element, which is oxygen. Again, changing the ending to "ide." And looking at the number of them that I have 2, and 2 is di, so carbon dioxide. All right, and then for my last example under the naming, again, I have C for carbon. I only have 1 of them, but remember that prefix mono is never placed on the first element, so I just leave it as is, as carbon. The second one, again, I used oxygen. This is super common. So oxide. This also has 1, but the prefix mono is used on the second element. So this would be carbon, sorry, I should have left myself more space, monoxide. So I use this one as an example to show you instances where you do put mono on the second element and instances where you do not put mono, which is on the first element. All right, bumping down into formula writing. So going back the other way, there's 2 simple steps. Okay, we'll use this first one as our example. If you're writing the formula for a covalent molecule, the first thing you're going to do is write the symbol for the first nonmetal. So dinitrogen, so I'm going to write the symbol for nitrogen, which is N. And then it says include subscript if prefix is given. I am told a prefix of di, so that tells me I'm going to have 2 of them. And then I have tetrahydride. So hydride is hydrogen, and tetra means I have 4 of them. All right, next example, I'm told it's iodine. There's no prefix in front of it, so I can assume that there is just 1. Because remember, we don't say mono for the first element. Then it's hexabromide. If I look up bromine on the periodic table, I'll see that it's Br. That does have a prefix in front of it. That hexa, I can refer back to my chart, and hexa is 6. So that's what that formula would look like. What's another kind of key difference between covalent and ionic is in covalent, the prefix tells you the number, your subscript, your number of atoms that are present. This is different from, if you viewed the ionic video yet, this is different because when I'm just going to go back to ionic, you are writing the charges which are then being balanced and with subscripts. So that the charges you get from the periodic table go on top, the subscripts you write in go on the bottom, and that's after you do the math that's involved in it. And that's another thing that students will sometimes confuse because that's a big difference between covalent and ionic. So hopefully that helps.